The lady wins.
Right, time for bed. I'm out.
No one's leaving, no excuses.
No, I've got to be up in the morning. I have a very demanding employer.
I'd stay, but I'm all out.
The Dollys win, you lose. The Dollys lose, you also lose. They are an expensive hobby, Harry.
There's our Harry, living it up. Fast women, hard liquor, and high-stakes gambling. Kind of makes you wonder how he's going to end up broke when this story's over. Well, let's see. It's 1918. Harry's wife has died, but his mother, Lois, is still alive. And she's still with Harry. As a matter of fact, his whole life they have lived together. They have always depended on each other, and now, with his wife gone, dead, he needs his mother more than ever. She's his shoulder to lean on when he needs to cry about grieving the loss of a wife he neglected. Rose was the one who played the biggest role in taking care of their children, and now Lois is stepping up to fill that void for her grandchildren because Harry can't. He's still largely unavailable to his family. And this is a shame when you think about how his own father abandoned him and his mother all of those years ago. Harry likely thinks that he's a much better man than his father, and in some ways he is. He is, at least, physically present and a provider for his family. A darn good provider. But he's more like his father than he would ever want to admit in almost every other way. I mean, he shares the same living space with his children and his wife when she was alive, but he didn't come home every night. In many ways, his wife was a single mother. But now she's gone. That was in May of 1918 that Harry had to make arrangements for Rose's funeral. Then just a couple of months later, it's July of the same year, and Harry has to make some more arrangements. But this time, it's for what should be a happy occasion. It's Rosalie's wedding. That's right. His eldest daughter is getting married, and not just to any old bloke. She's hooked a prince. Her fiancé is the Russian Prince Sergei de Bolotov. The July 25th, 1918 edition of the Chicago Tribune refers to him as an aviator, soldier, businessman, innovator. The same article mentions that he has the distinction of being the first Russian to build an airplane and fly in it. At the time of their engagement, Rosalie Selfridge is 24 and Sergei is 28. They have been courting for 4 years, which means that Rose, Harry's wife, got to know him in the years before her death. She wrote to her sister, who still lived in Chicago, about him. She said that he had a certain amount of charm, but she also noted that he had, quote, the most peculiar manners I've ever encountered. Not exactly a glowing endorsement. Now look, this guy was a giant red flag, and if Harry hadn't been so wrapped up in his own mistresses, he might have been able to warn his oldest daughter that Sergei was a fraud who was after her for the Selfridge name and the connection to her father's fortune. So here's the thing about him. He spent a good part of his marriage to Rosalie chasing down this Russian title. He even started referring to himself as Prince Vyazemsky in an effort to elevate his social standing. But the truth was that there was no legitimate historical recording linking him to the actual house of Vyazemsky, the old Russian noble family. But his ties to Harry Selfridge allowed him to keep up this charade for years. You can imagine that the people in Harry's social circles thought that there was no way that Harry wouldn't do his due diligence and fully vet the man his daughter was going to marry. And there was something else that was helping Sergei to pull off the self-appointed realty stunt. Another historical event, the Bolshevik Revolution. This was a period of political change in Russia that started in 1917, in which Russia abolished its monarchy and many of its aristocrats fled. And a lot of Russians fraudulently adopted royal titles once they got settled in other European countries. That's what Sergei did. And everyone just went along with it. So that meant that Rosalie was a princess. They had a daughter. She was a princess too. because Sergei was a prince, which we know he wasn't, but he was an aviation enthusiast and a complete failure as an aviation engineer. So he decided to be a good little son-in-law so that he could remain attached to Harry Selfridge's money. And Harry still has lots of money at this time, because he's sticking to his motto, business as usual. And that's what it was at his store. Come rain or shine, celebration or tragedy, Harry's going to have the doors of Selfridge's open. And that even means throughout World War I. Even after the store was damaged in a German Zeppelin bombing raid, Harry refused to close. He's a master of publicity, and he knows that keeping the store open is a symbol of defiance. And that only makes the Londoners love him even more. And Harry loves to be loved. As the locals continue to pour into Selfridge's, enjoying this place where they can shop, gather, and have a sense of normalcy despite the war, Harry's revenue increases, and he's spending his money almost as quickly as he earns it. But now, things are starting to get risky because Harry is mixing his personal finances with the store's money, and these expenses have very little to do with the store. He's throwing lavish parties and he's gambling. He really enjoys gambling. His store's books are a mess because, in his mind, all of the money is his. So when he wants to play poker and he doesn't have enough of his own money to do it, he simply takes money from the store to do it. Most nights, he wins. That means that some nights, he loses. And when he loses more than he can personally cover, he makes up for it by taking money from the store. And then there's his never-ending parade of mistresses. After Rose's death, Harry fully embraced his freedom to pursue women openly, while in the past, he had at least attempted to be somewhat discreet about his affairs, out of respect for his wife. Now there was no need for such pretense. These weren't affairs anymore. The women in Harry's life became more visible, more expensive, and more numerous. In 1921, he's mixing funds for a joyous occasion, another wedding. This time, it's his middle daughter, Violette. The Chicago Tribune announced on May 4th, 1921, Violette Selfridge to wed in laces of Marie Antoinette. The wedding wasn't going to be cheap. It was held at the Brompton Oratory, which is now called the London Oratory. It's this beautiful Roman Catholic church that could easily hold their 1,200 guests. After the ceremony, Harry hosted a reception for 600 at his home, the Lansdowne House. Now, this part is neither here nor there, but I think it's interesting. Violette's white satin gown was accompanied by laces that had once been owned and worn by Marie Antoinette. Harry didn't have to pay for those. You see, Violette was also marrying an aviator with a title. Only his title was real. He was the Viscount Jacques-Jean de Soubourg, and those laces had been passed down for generations in his family because he was the real deal. He truly came from a wealthy, aristocratic family, and by the time he met Violette, they still had their titles, but their money was gone. Violette was a target, an unsuspecting American dollar princess. After their honeymoon in Italy, the newlyweds moved in with Harry. Both of Harry's daughters had married men who were aviation enthusiasts, but neither one of the girls' husbands had the brilliant business acumen of their father. So Harry was supporting both of his daughters and their husbands. And this is where we see a startling trend. Harry's daughters were following their father's example in their own way. They were choosing men who had all of the flash and social standing, but none of the financial stability. The apple, as they say, doesn't fall far from the tree. As for Harry, he's still spending like there's no tomorrow. That disciplined young man who rose his way to the top at Marshall Fields was long gone. In his place stood a man who believed his golden touch would never fail him. a dangerous illusion for anyone, but catastrophic for someone with Harry's appetite for extravagance. To give credit where it's due, Harry was still displaying flashes of the innovative business genius that had made him famous. The Associated Press reported in October 1922 that Harry was experimenting with the latest technology. Lipton talks to London by radio. Sir Thomas Lipton, the famous yachtsman, had spoken to London by radio, and Harry Gordon Selfridge confirmed receiving the message from a local department store broadcasting station. Harry was embracing radio just as it was becoming mainstream, always ahead of the curve in retail. He understood that technology was changing how people communicated, and he wanted his store to be part of that revolution. He was installing state-of-the-art innovations at Selfridge's, while many of his competitors were still relying on the old ways of doing business. By 1922, Harry's eye had wandered to a new star on the London stage. Her name was Elise Delicia, a French singer and actress who was appearing as a dancer in a popular revue at the time. Elise was exactly Harry's type: beautiful, talented, and in the public eye. Contemporaries reported that Harry was head over heels for her, following the same pattern he had established with his previous showgirl mistresses. He would encourage her to appear at Selfridge's for promotional events and would dress her in furs and jewels, effectively using his store's inventory to adorn his latest conquest. This wasn't just generosity on Harry's part. It was also good business. Having a glamorous star like Elise appear at the store would draw crowds and generate publicity. But the line between business and pleasure was increasingly blurred in Harry's mind. The furs and jewels he lavished on Elise became presents rather than loans, adding to his mounting personal expenses. Elise was no Gaby Deslys in terms of draining Harry's finances, but she was another link in the chain of expensive relationships that were slowly but surely chipping away at his fortune. And like his affairs had been in the past, this relationship was conducted openly, with little regard for public opinion or the potential damage to his reputation. At least this time around, there was no wife around for him to embarrass. But even as his business sense remained sharp, his personal life was about to take another hit, one that would remove the last guardrail preventing his complete self-destruction. In 1923, Harry's mother, Lois, was photographed holding her great-grandson, Violette's child. She managed one last trip to Chicago with Harry's youngest daughter, Beatrice. The photo, published in newspapers, showed an elderly but dignified woman, still the pillar of the Selfridge family after all of these years. But the following year brought devastating news. The Chicago Daily Tribune reported on February 26, 1924, Mrs. Selfridge dies in London, her son cables. Lois Selfridge, mother of Harry Gordon Selfridge, had died at her son's home in London. She was 90 years old. The article noted that she had a wonderful and beautiful death, according to Harry's cable. She had lived a long life and had no fear of death. Harry was quoted as saying, "She was glad to get home to her family, and she talked cheerfully to us before the end." There he was again, putting on a show for the press and the cameras. But the truth was that he was falling apart on the inside. Harry had lost his rock, his North Star. Ever since his father left and his brothers died, there was always Harry and his mother. The Pantograph of September 25, 1924, published Harry's tribute to his mother. Selfridge gives his mother all the credit. In it, Harry stated, "It all happened because I had a good mother and I believed in her. In my small hometown, my mother used to tell me stories. We were not blessed with too much of the world's goods, but my mother devoted herself to bringing me up properly, and one of the things she taught me in those early days of struggle was the meaning of supposing." He recalled how she would say, "Supposing, Harry, you were the man who had worked his way up and made a fortune. Let's suppose how you would live. And we know that this exercise in imagination shaped his aspirations and dreams. He credited these early lessons for his success, saying, "Sometimes it would be one thing, sometimes another, but it always was supposing what might await me in the years to come." Harry's mother had been his constant companion and moral compass throughout his life. She watched him go from earning $1.50 a week as a cash boy to becoming one of the world's most successful retailers. She'd seen him through poverty, success, scandal, and war. Actually, they had done that for each other, and now, without her steadying influence, Harry's worst tendencies would begin to flourish unchecked. You can trace a direct line from Lois Selfridge's death to Harry's accelerated spending and increasingly reckless behavior. She had been the one person who could tell Harry no, the one voice he respected enough to occasionally heed. Without her gentle but firm guidance, there was no one left to curb his excesses, no one whose disapproval he feared. His daughters tried, as did some of his closest business associates, but their concerns fell on deaf ears. Harry was now completely unfettered, a man with enormous wealth and appetites, but without any internal restraints. His name was Selfridge, not self-control. And this loss in 1924 couldn't have come at a worse time, because the following year would bring something even more dangerous to Harry's door. Or rather, two somethings. Before we get to the duo that would ultimately destroy Harry's finances, there's another name that occasionally surfaces in accounts of his romantic life: Edwina Mountbatten, Countess Mountbatten of Burma. While their relationship remains somewhat speculative and is often just mentioned as a rumor in historical accounts, the connection between Harry and Edwina adds another layer of intrigue to his already colorful romantic history. Edwina was no ordinary socialite. As the daughter of Wilfred William Ashley, later 1st Baron Mount Temple, and Amalia Mary Maud Cassell, she was England's richest heiress. Her maternal grandfather was the extremely wealthy financier Sir Ernest Cassell, who left her the bulk of his fortune when she was just 21 years old. In 1922, she married Lord Louis Mountbatten, a great-grandson of Queen Victoria and uncle to Prince Philip, who would later marry the future Queen of Elizabeth II. Despite her marriage, Edwina was known for her independent lifestyle and rumored to have had numerous affairs. For Harry, a connection with Edwina would have represented the ultimate social coup. An affair with a genuine member of the British aristocracy, connected to the royal family and one of the wealthiest women in England, it would have aligned perfectly with his lifelong aspiration to be accepted by the highest echelons of society. Whether the affair was real or merely gossip, the association with Edwina's name only added to Harry's reputation as a man who moved in the most exclusive circles, both in business and in his personal life. But even Edwina Mountbatten would pale in comparison to the two women who would soon enter Harry's life and hasten his financial downfall like nothing before. Enter the Dolly Sisters. In 1925, Harry met identical twin sisters Jenny and Rosie Dolly, Hungarian-born dancers known professionally as the Dolly Sisters. The twins had been born Janci and Rosicka Deutsch in Budapest in 1892 and immigrated to America as children. They started performing in vaudeville at a young age, and by the 1920s had become international stars known for their beauty, their lavish lifestyle, and their burlesque-style dance routines. By the time Harry met them, the Dolly sisters' popularity was actually fading, but they were still glamorous enough to catch Harry's eye at the exclusive Kit Kat Club in London. This wasn't some ordinary nightclub. The membership fee alone cost more than the average working-class person in 1920s Britain earned in a month. and the twins commanded an astounding 500 pounds per week for their performances. That's equivalent to around $37,000 in today's money. The moment Harry laid eyes on the identical beauties, he was smitten. They were, as you know, exactly his type. Famous, beautiful, and exotic. But unlike his previous conquests, the Dolly sisters came as a pair. That didn't bother Harry one bit. In his mind, that only meant double the fun, double the beauty, and double the sex. They made a fortune as dancers on 2 continents and became favorites in London's smart society. By the time they sashayed into Harry's life, they were as famous for their gambling as for their dancing. Harry adopted them both, and Jenny, the prettier of the two, became his special favorite. But both sisters would become fixtures in his life while he was in his midlife crisis phase of late-night partying on the French Riviera. Let's be clear, the Dolly sisters weren't just showgirls. They were celebrities who moved in the highest social circles. They had dated royalty, millionaires, and film stars. They wore the latest fashions, dripped with jewels, and lived a lifestyle that made even Harry's extravagant habits seem modest by comparison. And they had expensive taste. Very expensive taste. Harry wasted no time in pursuing Jenny. She was 33 years old, and though he was in his late 60s, the age difference didn't matter. It never does to the older person in these types of relationships, does it? He became completely infatuated with her, showering her with expensive gifts and taking her, often with Rosie in tow, to the finest restaurants, theaters, parties, and hotels in London. The relationship with the twins gave Harry a new burst of energy. Contemporaries noted that he seemed rejuvenated in their company, almost giddy with excitement. He loved being seen with these beautiful celebrities, loved the attention it brought him in the press, loved being the envy of other men. He felt like he did back when he had the stunner Gaby Deslys on his arms, but times 2. And it's worth mentioning that Gaby and Jenny Dolly had been good friends, likely around the time that Gaby was his mistress, so there's that. But there was something else about the Dolly sisters that made them particularly dangerous for Harry. They loved to gamble, and I mean loved to gamble. Now, Harry had always enjoyed a flutter at the card tables himself, but what had been a casual pastime became an obsession under the influence of the Dolly sisters. Jenny, in particular, was a compulsive gambler. She believed she had a system that couldn't fail, a way to beat the house. She didn't. It wasn't long before the trio was hitting the casinos of London, Paris, and the French Riviera regularly, sometimes winning, but more often losing spectacularly. And always it was Gentleman Harry picking up the tab for the ladies' losses. One particularly disastrous expedition to the casinos of the French Riviera in 1928 saw Harry losing almost 100,000 pounds in a single spree. That's over $9 million in today's money. The American newspapers couldn't get enough of the scandalous story. One reported, Miss Jenny Dolly of the Dolly Sisters, who has played $100,000 at the casino tables in Cannes in recent months, is keeping up her sensational playing in the face of many defeats. The article described how she has squandered various fortunes and noted that Harry Gordon Selfridge is devoted to both Jenny Dolly and her sister Rosie. Yet every afternoon for the past 4 months, Jenny Dolly and Harry Selfridge have been seeking their fortune at the casino. The paper continued with the juicy details. Each afternoon, she is there in charge, placing 100,000 francs at once on a single number. So far, Harry's Railway, a system of placing chips on 3 numbers in a row, has lost more money than the Chicago Tribune's circulation fund. Think about that for a minute. Harry is losing more at the gambling tables in a single afternoon then would be required to run the entire circulation department of a major newspaper. That's the scale of his gambling habit at this time. The article went on. The casino cannot lose as long as it can find Americans like Jenny Dolly and Harry Selfridge with money to spend. While playing roulette, Selfridge is like the bank. He's there with the francs when Jenny pushes stack after stack of 100 franc notes across to the chef. 10 of the Riviera's hotel's winter season profits depend on these two players. What's particularly striking is that this gambling binge was happening in 1928, just a year before the Wall Street crash that would herald the Great Depression. Harry was hemorrhaging money at the worst possible time, right before the global economy would take a serious nosedive. But Harry couldn't see what was coming. He was blinded by his obsession with Jenny. He proposed marriage to her multiple times and showered her with extravagant presents, including a diamond bracelet valued at 50,000 pounds. That's over $3 million in today's money. When Jenny wasn't gambling, she was shopping, and Harry was only too happy to foot the bill. Like Gaby Deslys before her, she had an open account at Selfridge's and would regularly sweep through the store, selecting the most expensive items without a second thought. Harry's infatuation with Jenny knew no bounds. When she expressed an interest in a particular property, Harry bought it for her. When she mentioned she'd like a new car, a gleaming luxury model would appear outside her door the next day. When she lost hundreds of thousands at the casino, Harry would quietly settle the debt. Meanwhile, in his public life, Harry maintained the appearance of the successful businessman and socialite. In July 1927, the Chicago Tribune reported on one of his lavish social events. Frederick T. Haskell's guests at dinner of Selfridge's in London. The article mentioned a dinner party given last month at Lansdowne House by Harry Gordon Selfridge and his daughter, Princess Wyazemski, who was Rosalie. The guest list read like a who's who of European aristocracy. Countess this, lady that. These dinner parties cost a fortune, but Harry considers them essential to maintaining his social position. He was still living the high life and spending big to maintain his status among the elite of London society. Harry wasn't content to just host the aristocracy. He wanted to live among them. The Chicago Tribune reported on October 31st, 1929, coincidentally just after the Wall Street crash that would trigger the Great Depression, Harry Gordon Selfridge, who has lived for long at Lansdowne House, London, is to move soon to number 5 Carlton House Terrace, the townhouse of the Countess of Caledon. The article noted his new prestigious neighbors would include the Duke of Marlborough, the Earl of Donegal, and Major J.J. Astor. Yes, you heard that right. J.J. Astor, that's John Jacob Astor V, first cousin of John Jacob Astor IV, who went down with the Titanic. Harry was now rubbing shoulders with some of the wealthiest families in the world. But all this came with a price tag, and the timing couldn't have been worse. Carlton House Terrace was one of the most prestigious addresses in London, with rents to match. Harry was upsizing his lifestyle as the world economy was about to crash. The Wall Street crash had just occurred on October 24th, 1929, and the world was about to plunge into the Great Depression. This was a catastrophic error in judgment that showed just how disconnected Harry had become from financial reality. He was still operating as if his resources were unlimited, even as signs of the coming economic storm were appearing all around him. As the 1930s began, Selfridge's department store would soon feel the impact of the Depression as customers tightened their purse strings. Sales declined and profits shrank, but Harry kept spending as if nothing had changed. His relationship with the Dolly Sisters, particularly Jenny, only intensified. By 1930, he was spending more time with them than at his store. The business that had been his pride and joy, the enterprise that he had built from the ground up, was repeatedly being left in the hands of his managers to deal with while he went off gallivanting with the sexy twins. The relationship between Jenny and Harry became so serious that by 1928, engagement rumors were swirling through the international society circles. The Daily News reported on March 28, 1928, with the headline, "Report, Jenny Dolly to marry Selfridge." According to the article, H. Gordon Selfridge, the former Chicago multimillionaire London department store owner, would soon wed Jenny Dolly, one of the two famous Dancing Sisters team, if the word of close friends was based on fact. The same newspaper explained that with Jenny's twin sister Rosie happily married to Mortimer Davis, whose multimillionaire father died a few days ago, Jenny might finally feel free to marry Harry. The article claimed that Jenny had previously refused to marry until Rose's future was assured because she was unwilling to break up the dancing act and leave her sister without means of livelihood. Just a day later, on March 29, 1928, the Press and Sun Bulletin ran a small headline. One of Dolly's sisters reported engaged to H. Gordon Selfridge, further fueling the gossip in social circles on both sides of the Atlantic. Harry was certainly smitten enough to propose. By this point, he had been pursuing Jenny for years and had spent millions on her. Marriage would have formalized their relationship and perhaps given Harry more control over Jenny's gambling habits, which were by now severely draining his finances. But despite the press reports, there was never a wedding. Jenny continued her independent lifestyle, and Harry continued to fund it. The engagement rumors demonstrated just how entangled Harry had become with Jenny, not just emotionally, but in the public eye as well. The retail king of London was now more famous for his relationship with a dancing twin than for his business innovations. And this is foreshadowing how big of a role Jenny will eventually play in his legacy. Jenny had Harry wrapped around her finger. According to some of their friends, she could get him to do almost anything, and what she wanted, more than anything, was money to gamble with. As Harry's gambling losses mounted and the depression hit his business, his personal and professional finances became more and more entangled together. He was withdrawing more and more money from Selfridge's to cover his personal expenses and gambling debts. By 1932, the company's board was growing seriously concerned. Sales were down, of course, due to the depression, and Harry's withdrawals were putting additional strain on the company's finances. But Harry was still the face of the business, the retail genius who had revolutionized shopping in London. They were reluctant to confront him directly. Behind closed doors, board members were asking each other difficult questions that they dare not ask Harry. How much money had he taken? Could the company survive his spending? Was he still fit to lead? The answers that they came up with were not reassuring. In his defense, Harry would point to his past successes, his innovations, his understanding of what customers wanted. But as time went on, it seemed like he was living in the past, relying on old glories while failing to adapt to the harsh new economic realities. One particularly telling incident occurred in 1932 when Harry proposed a series of lavish promotional events for the store. The board, looking at the costs, politely but firmly turned him down. Harry was furious. This was his store, his vision. He went ahead with a scaled-down version of the events and paid for it out of his own pocket. But his own pocket was a lot emptier than it had been just a few years earlier. It's estimated that between 1929 and 1933, Harry withdrew around £160,000 from the business for his personal expenses. That's equivalent to over $14 million in today's money. This was in addition to his official salary and dividends. And a significant portion of that money went straight into Jenny Dolly's handbag, which you can bet was designer, and from there to the casino tables of Europe. Then in 1933, everything changed. The Buffalo Courier-Express of March 12, 1933 carried the headline, "Jenny Dolly gravely hurt in auto crash." While traveling at 75 miles an hour with French pilot Max Constant, their sports car crashed near Bordeaux, 30 miles from Paris. Jenny was seriously injured, her face badly cut, her stomach displaced into her lung chamber. The article noted Jenny's, quote, "prolonged absence from Paris has given rise to rumors that she has gone to London to meet Harry Gordon Selfridge and about to sell her jewels, valued at $1 million. End quote. Even amid this tragedy, the press couldn't resist linking her to Harry. The crash was devastating for Jenny. Not only was she physically injured, but her face, the face that had made her famous, that had graced magazine covers and enchanted audiences around the world, was badly disfigured. For a woman whose entire career and identity were built on her beauty, this was catastrophic. Jenny required dozens of operations and plastic surgeries to reconstruct her face. The medical bills were enormous. To pay her expenses, she was forced to sell off most of her jewelry collection, the very jewels that Harry had given her over the years. But even that wasn't enough. When the money from selling her jewels ran out, guess who stepped in to pay for her treatments? Harry, of course. Despite his own precarious financial situation, Harry couldn't bear to see Jenny suffer. He remained the knight in shining armor for his damsel in distress, even as his own financial empire was crumbling around him. The accident marked the end of Jenny's career as a performer. She would never dance professionally again. And with her career gone and her beauty marred, many of her society friends drifted away. But not Harry. He remained devoted to her, visiting when he could, sending presents, paying for her medical bills, and offering emotional support, which was something that he rarely managed to do for his wife when she needed it. For Harry, this was a pattern we've seen before: rescuing women in distress, being the hero, being the provider. It clearly filled some deep need in him, perhaps connected to his early years with his mother when they had struggled together after his father's abandonment. I don't know. But this time, Harry simply couldn't afford his gallantry. His finances were in shambles, his business was struggling, and the board of Selfridges was running out of patience with his financial improprieties. Jenny's accident should have been a wake-up call for Harry, a moment to reassess his priorities and his spending. Instead, it just became one more drain on his ever-dwindling resources, one more reason to dip into company funds. By 1939, the truth could no longer be hidden. Selfridges was in deep trouble, and Harry Gordon Selfridge was the cause. An audit revealed the extent of his personal withdrawals from the company, and the board was forced to act. They approached Harry with their findings, expecting denial or anger. Instead, they found a man who seemed genuinely surprised by the numbers. It was as if he had never kept track, never added it all up, never considered that there might be a bottom to the well of money. It was crazy. The man who had all the business acumen required to build that great store was sincerely caught off guard when the results of his actions were revealed to him. As for his son, Gordon Selfridge Jr., his relationship with his father became significantly complicated as Harry's financial situation deteriorated. Gordon had worked in the family business for years, initially learning the trade under his father's guidance. Many had expected that Gordon would eventually take over the business, maintaining the Selfridge family legacy. Gordon and Harry were among those many. That was the family plan. Gordon had been groomed from an early age to follow in his father's footsteps. He had been educated at prestigious schools and had received extensive training in all aspects of the retail business. Unlike his father, who had built his career from nothing, Gordon had every advantage, every door open for him. He was spoon-fed every detail of merchandising. In the early 1930s, as Harry's bad money moves were becoming more apparent, Gordon found himself in an impossible situation. He was loyal to his father, but also concerned about the future of the business that bore their name. Board members who used to go to Harry for every decision were now turning to Gordon, seeing him as the more reasonable Selfridge, the one who might be able to rein in his father. But nobody could tell Harry Selfridge what to do. He never listened to anyone, and if he ever was going to take directions from anyone, he certainly wasn't going to start with his son. When the banks finally moved to take control of Selfridge's in 1939, Gordon was placed in the awkward position of having to side with the board against his own father. Some accounts suggest that Gordon had little choice. The evidence of his father's financial mismanagement was overwhelming, and the business would have failed completely without some kind of intervention. Harry reportedly felt betrayed by what he perceived as his son's failure to stand by him. In his mind, Gordon should have fought to keep him in control of the business, regardless of the financial realities. The rift between father and son was never fully healed, adding another layer of personal tragedy to Harry's professional downfall. There were even whispers that Gordon had actively worked against his father in the final years, perhaps seeing his father's removal as the only way to salvage what remained of the family's stake in the business. Whether these rumors had any basis in fact or were simply the product of Harry's paranoia in his declining years, they poisoned the relationship between the Selfridge men. With Gordon's influence, the board gave Harry an ultimatum: repay what he had taken or face consequences. But Harry, who had been able to save every woman he had ever taken to bed, didn't have the money to save himself. His personal fortune was gone, squandered on the Dolly sisters, on their gambling, on mansions and parties and jewels and all of the trappings of the high life. In 1939, just as World War II was beginning, Harry was going into his own personal war, and he would have no choice but to surrender. Of course, his war was against his store. He was forced to resign from the board of Selfridges, leaving him as a mere figurehead without influence. This was a devastating blow to a man who had built the business from nothing, who had revolutionized retail, and who had once been hailed as a genius, whose very identity was that store. Harry was now sidelined from his own creation. His office, once the command center of a retail empire, was cleared out. His name remained above the door, but inside, decisions were being made without him. Now, the board could force him out, but they couldn't stop him from spending his own money. And even after being discarded with practically no income, Harry continued to spend as if money were flowing from a never-ending waterfall. By 1940, due to, surprise, surprise, mounting financial difficulties, the banks had seized control of his store to safeguard their investments. This marked the end of any of Harry's involvement with the company he had founded. It was a staggering fall from grace. The multi-millionaire shop owner was now practically penniless, living on a small pension and on the support of friends. But what of Jenny Dolly, the woman who had played such a pivotal role in Harry's downfall? Well, After her accident, Jenny eventually recovered enough to resume some semblance of a normal life, though she would never perform again. She entered into a relationship with and later married Chicago lawyer Bernard Viniski in 1935. And they adopted 2 teenage daughters who were dancers themselves. To the outside world, it seemed like Jenny had moved on from Harry, had found a new life with a new man. But reports suggest that they remained in contact, with Harry continuing to offer financial support when he could, which is absolutely insane because we know that his resources were now severely limited. But we also know that this isn't Harry's first time lending financial support to a married woman he's involved with. Nothing, and I mean nothing, not even losing all of his money, could change the way that this man decided to behave. Well, in a final, tragic twist, in 1941, when it seemed that Jenny Dolly's life was back on track, she committed suicide by hanging herself with a bright silk sash in the bathroom of her Hollywood apartment. Ironically, that's now 2 of Harry's lovers whose lives ended with beautiful accessories around their necks. Remember what happened to the dancer, Isadora Duncan? Some speculated that Jenny's suicide was triggered by ongoing pain from her injuries or by depression over the loss of her career and beauty. Others suggested financial troubles or problems in her marriage. Whatever the reason, the woman who had once dazzled European society, who had gambled millions at the casino tables, who had captivated Harry Gordon Selfridge to the point of obsession, was gone. The news devastated Harry. Jenny had been the great love of his later years, the woman for whom he had sacrificed everything. Her death seemed to mark the final chapter in Harry's own story of decline. It was yet another blow in Harry's long list of losses. His wife, his mother, his fortune, his business, and now Jenny. Isn't life a wild ride? The man who'd once had everything now seemed to have nothing but memories and a few pounds to his name. Harry spent his final years as a mere visitor to the store he had built. He would often take the bus, no more fancy chauffeured cars, to Oxford Street, walk around Selfridge's and chat with customers and staff, though he never called them staff or employees. It was his custom to spend hours watching reactions to the window displays and talk with shoppers. According to those who knew him in these later years, Harry never expressed bitterness about his fate. He seemed to accept it with a certain composure and level-headedness, a recognition that perhaps his excesses had finally caught up with him. His children did what they could for him, but they too had suffered from his financial collapse. The vast inheritance that they once expected was gone. His daughters' marriages had altered. Violette divorced Jacques, while Rosalie remained married to her fraudulent prince, but lived in severely reduced circumstances. After Harry's removal from the board, Gordon remained with the company for a time, but eventually left to pursue other business interests. The dream of a Selfridge dynasty in retail died with Harry's financial collapse. Gordon's own business career never reached the heights of his father's. He lacked Harry's flair, his visionary approach to retail, and his ability to connect with customers. But most men did. Harry was one of a kind, and let's face it, when a man sets the bar so high in his own field of expertise, it is often very hard for his children to compete or compare on the same level of greatness. We see it all the time. These days, we call those offspring nepotism babies. The relationship between Harry and Gordon remains one of the great what-ifs of the Selfridge story. Had Harry been more responsible with his finances, and had he maintained control of the business, would Gordon have eventually taken over and continued the Selfridge legacy? Or was Gordon simply not cut out for the role that his father envisioned for him? We will never know. In his final years, as Harry adjusted to life without his wealth or status, he found comfort in one last relationship. His lover's name was Marcelle Roget. She was a would-be movie star who had become what many described as the last great love of Harry's life. A beautiful blonde woman, typical of the film stars of that era, Marcelle was on her way to Hollywood when she met the aging retail magnate. She had roles in a few films, including Cotton Queen and Big Fella in 1937 and Almost a Gentleman in 1938. None of them major hits, not big enough to give her any kind of foothold in the industry. At this point in his life, Harry was in no position to get the hottest performers on the market like he had been able to do in the 1910s and the 1920s. By the time Harry met Marcelle, he had little to offer her materially. His days of buying homes for his mistresses and girlfriends and showering them with jewels were long gone. Yet Marcelle seemed genuinely fond of Harry, spending time with him when many of his fair-weather friends had disappeared. Who knows? Maybe she was the first woman who was genuinely interested in Harry since his wife. Their relationship was far less public than Harry's previous romantic entanglements, partly because Harry was no longer newsworthy in the way that he had once been, and partly because they simply couldn't afford the lavish public outings that had characterized his affairs with Gaby Deslys and the Dolly Sisters. Instead, they would take modest trips together, dine in expensive restaurants, and spend quiet evenings at Harry's small flat. It was a far cry from the high-flying lifestyle Harry had once enjoyed, but there was perhaps something more genuine about this relationship than many of his other earlier conquests. Marcelle stayed with Harry until close to the end, one of the few bright spots in his twilight years. She represented the kind of relationship Harry had rarely experienced, one based on companionship rather than spectacle, on genuine affection rather than material exchange. But if there was going to be a relationship for him, that's the way it was going to have to be. He didn't have any more grand mansions or castles lying around, just a small flat in Putney. There were no fancy neighbors, no servants, hardly any visitors. His health was failing, and he rarely ventured out, except for his occasional bus trips to Selfridge's. Finally, on May 10th, 1947, the Newcastle Morning Herald reported, "Merchant adventurer ordered round coffin." The article noted, quote, "Harry Gordon Selfridge, merchant adventurer who died yesterday at the age of 90, had ordered his executors, buy me a round coffin. Then I'll have room, if necessary, to turn in my grave." End quote. The story stated that Harry was a patron of Gaby Deslys when her dancing made her the talk of Britain, and in the early 1920s of Jenny Dolly of the Dolly Sisters. And guess what? Even in his death, there was no mention of Rose, his wife. That says so much about how big of a role his mistresses played in his early career life. The article continued, "The American errand boy who founded London's great department store was earning £200,000 a year in his 40s and became one of the first figures in two countries, world of commerce and society." But it ended by noting that money flowed from his hands as easily as it came. And that's a pretty good way to sum up his story. At the height of his career, Harry's personal fortune was estimated at roughly £2 million. That's over £150 million in today's money. Yet when he died, his bank account contained just £6,176, less than 1% of what he had once possessed. A teeny tiny fraction compared to the millions he had made and spent. but I suppose that all in all, he had a ball. The round coffin he had requested, a final eccentric touch from a man who had never done anything in the conventional way, never materialized. Harry was buried in a standard coffin in St. Mark's Churchyard in Highcliffe, near his wife, Rose. Now she could finally have her husband to herself. Except his mother, Lois, was also there. In a retrospective news article about his life almost 9 years after he passed, the Sydney Morning Herald reflected under the headline, "Women Brought Him Wealth and Ruin." The story said flat out, quote, "No man ever lost more money through women than Harry Gordon Selfridge." The Herald noted that Harry built a £6 million fortune out of London's trade. To put that in perspective, that sum would have been enough to build and fully stock another Selfridge's store. It was more than the annual revenue of many well-established department stores of that era. And Harry spent it all on 2 women in less than a decade. There were a number of articles written about Harry nearly a decade after his death, and they showed just how completely the Dolly sisters had come to define his legacy in many ways. Most of the stories don't even mention his wife. His retail innovations, his customer service philosophy, his marketing genius, all were overshadowed by the scandal of his relationship with the twins and the fortune he squandered on them. After all of his amazing accomplishments, this mess with Jenny Dolly was what he would be remembered for. His children became social pariahs, going from extreme wealth to mere modesty. It might have felt like poverty to people who had always lived in such a grand fashion. That life goes on, with or without us. The store Harry Selfridge created continued to thrive under new management, surviving both the Depression and World War II, adapting to changing tastes and circumstances in ways that Harry, in his later years, was unable to do. In one of the great ironies of Harry's story, the very qualities that made him a retail genius, his understanding of desire, of wanting, of the pleasure of acquisition, of the importance of catering to women, were the same qualities that led to his ruin when applied to his personal life. His innovations, from the placement of the perfume counter at the entrance to the creation of the bargain basement, are now standard practice in department stores worldwide, even as brick-and-mortar stores and shopping malls are becoming extinct. But alongside his business legacy runs the cautionary tale of his personal life. The man who knew the value of everything ultimately failed to understand the cost of his own desires. The moral of the story is, the next time you build a multi-million-dollar fortune and you think about blowing it all on gambling and loose women or loose men, don't. Oh, and you might recall that I told you about John Jacob Astor V being one of Harry's neighbors. Well, he was the first cousin of John Jacob Astor IV, Titanic's richest passenger who died in the tragedy, and whose second son was born months after the sinking. People often ask why his son is J.J. Astor VI instead of the fifth. Well, it's because the British Astor, Harry's neighbor, was born first. J.J. Astor VI wasn't pleased about being number 6, but he wasn't pleased about much of anything. Maybe that's why he went through life being called the rich boy nobody wants. I published a video about his miserable life that you can see here. I will also leave links to it in the description box and the pinned comment of this video. My sources for this story are on the screen. I hope that you have enjoyed this tale so far. If you love these scandalous stories from history that make Ty's hot mess history a time capsule for the culture, hit subscribe and the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Give this video a thumbs up. It's free and helps a ton. Whether you're watching or listening, thank you for letting me be a part of your day. This video has been brought to you by me. Well, me and my new YouTube channel, Verified YouTube Guide. Are you just starting your YouTube journey and feeling overwhelmed? Don't worry, I've got you covered. My channel, Verified YouTube Guide, is your go-to resource for practical, step-by-step tips to grow and monetize your channel. It's literally follow-along video tutorials. I'm showing you the steps I took to get 180,000 subscribers on YouTube. So if you don't know how to do something, you can just copy my work one step at a time. From setting up your channel to showing you how you can earn money at any stage on YouTube. And I'm not just talking about YouTube ad revenue. If you have something important to say or a service to sell, start talking about it on YouTube now. Don't wait. Subscribe to Verified YouTube Guide today, and let's build your channel together. You don't have to figure this out alone. The link is in the description box. I'll see you there.